Dr. Yatun, welcome to In Conversation.
Thank you for having me.
If we look at the Indonesian student movements in the past, I mean, they've even been associated with toppling presidents.
Yes.
We look at, Suharto, that was also a very strong student movement. Are Indonesian students fundamentally different in any way from other students all around the world?
Not at all, and that's very interesting to see. They might have had their own very specific historical tradition that makes them specifically Indonesian students, a long tradition of student struggle, which can be traced back to the colonial era and everything. But the students now, they have kind of, they still are very much rooted in that tradition, but they're also very much connected to more global youth struggles. And that's what makes them different from previous generations in Indonesia and more akin, more affiliated, more attuned with, other people from that generation worldwide, I would say.
But what we saw last year, that we haven't seen for a very long time on the streets of Jakarta. Why did that happen?
No, it's been 20 years since we've seen this kind of scenes in Indonesia with mass protests all over the country also, which is very important. And what happened then was actually a sort of expression of something that has been brewing for a much longer time, because there's been a very deep sort of disgruntlement, disenchantment with the political establishment. We're brewing among young people in Indonesia for several years now. I would say a very specific point, if we need to pinpoint a historical moment, would be 2017 with the Ahok affair, when the then governor of Jakarta was jailed in the end for alleged blasphemy. And that's when a switch happened in young people's and actually more progressive general publics in Indonesia in their perception of the political establishment under Jokowi Dodo's presidency. Because previously, of course, he was the hero of the people, of the progressive public. They thought that he would finally really bring democratization to Indonesia and a progressive kind of politics. And then this happened. So this kind of, this switch that happened then, because nobody expected that he would actually be jailed, that Ahok would be jailed. There were a lot of mobilizations, mass protests, in a very youthful manner. Actually, there were pop-up protests. There were what's the name for it? Flash mobs and everything being organized to defend Ahok and prevent him from going to jail. And still, that all didn't prevent it from happening. So this very slowly and gradually kind of prepared, especially young people, who were very much fans, supporters of Ahok and Jokowi. It kind of prepared them for the idea that, hey, maybe Jokowi might not be as heroically, daring a real breakthrough leader as we had expected him to be. So this is where criticism started to brew.
Some would say that it's been fueled by social media, that in fact it's been enabled by it, and you wouldn't have it happen to this scale if it wasn't for WhatsApp, if it wasn't for crowdfunding websites which allow them to raise money for this sort of thing.
Yeah,
that's
absolutely.
one part of it. Is that true?
To a large extent, it's definitely true, because but it's not necessarily just the scale that was enabled, or the very happening of the protest that was enabled by social media, but also the very different character, which really makes this movement very different from previous student movements that we've seen before.
What's this different character?
Well, the main different character is suddenly masses of students who would never join a demonstration otherwise, felt called upon and felt stimulated and felt it would be fun also to actually take to the streets.
They are the ones who are the new, so to say, entrants?
The initiative came from non-campus-based youth groups and existing activist groups that had in recent years, seen this very marked kind of rejuvenation in its membership also. So they took the initiative for the protest. We saw these calls on social media. It was really buzzing with all kinds of very attractive kind of illustrations, including to-do lists also for the unexperienced student demonstrator, like, hey, you're gonna be in the sun, this isn't what you're used to, so wear some sunscreen, dress lightly, bring your own water bottle.
But what you're saying makes these student protests sound as if they're like a picnic, not something that's more serious.
It makes it dead serious, actually. And what I find very interesting is the list of demands that were so easily adopted by these, fun-loving, kind of meme-loving students. So if you look at the list of demands that really went viral before the protest, it was formulated by different groups at different variations actually. But one of the most well-spread lists was one formulated by the Alliance for People's Movement, which was based in Yogyakarta. They had 9 very serious political demands, including Papua, and the military oppression there, and all human rights, or the criminalization of all human rights organizations. All kinds of bills were being criticized. So, and all of that was grouped under this single hashtag, which made it palpable to kind of non-very political youth who weren't very well versed into the issues being addressed. But for these young people, not all of them might have an exact understanding of the bills and the issues that were being addressed, the demands and everything. Even I don't understand fully all the demands being put on the table there. But what it did demonstrate is that all these different bills, each new policy introduced by this particular government represented another nail in the coffin of democracy. And this is something that they could fully understand and feel, because this is something that they've been observing.
If we look at some of the recent polls which look at approval ratings for President Joko Widodo, the approval ratings are going up. Yep. He's doing very well, in fact, in his second term. And specifically, actually, also when people are asked, the general public are asked about freedom of speech and other reforms, they all say that he's doing fine.
Yeah.
So are these students out of sync with the general public?
Or the other way around. That
could be, yes.
No, there is a very strong sense that there is indeed a generational gap involved in this matter. But it's not just a generational gap. I mean, there are a lot of young voters, who still support Jokowi fully, because they still believe that he will push through the progressive agenda that he promised in the elections and in the previous elections in 2014, and all the policies that are slightly more conservative than they like to see as well. They said, well, that's not Jokowi's doing. Actually, he has to compromise in order to get his own agenda through. But then you see that, this argument is losing its force, especially among peers, because, and this is, again, I want to bring up an online example. So there's this one running gag online that says, Jokowi's typical reaction to criticism, like, it wasn't me, Parliament made me do it. And this kind of jokes, gradually, it's a very clear indicator that Jokowi's popularity is gradually waning, and a clear indicator that his magical aura that he had for a long time, especially among young voters, is gradually dissipating as well.
Social media is often seen as something that the young use to organize, raise funding for the things that they believe in. But the flip side is that it also makes them vulnerable, doesn't it, to manipulation?
This is a real problem, and this is a real issue. But if you look at the character, right, of the young netizen, and you look at how they were politically socialized on the internet, how they learned about politics and how they learned to form political attitudes, by relying on all kinds of different sources online that were circulating online, then they possess a certain digital literacy, you could say, that makes them much less vulnerable to this kind of manipulation. As a matter of fact, they are very central also in kind of exposing these kind of efforts of manipulation. And what you see
So you're saying that they are less vulnerable to misinformation and fake news?
Absolutely, absolutely. So whereas the general public, that is also on social media, that they might be less digitally literate, so to speak, because they haven't been socialized from a young age into consuming and dissecting and selecting different information sources. I wouldn't say they fall victim, but it's easier to kind of inflame existing feelings. So it's not that it creates polarization or something like that. There's been polarization all along, but it's become much more hated through social media communications. But that is indeed the general, the general electorate. And this new generation that we see arising now...
More skeptical?
This new generation, absolutely. They're super skeptical. And the people that I've interviewed, and these include both millennials and Gen Z, whatever the separation, the cutoff is indeed. They are very skeptical, and they were very skeptical from the very beginning already, so much earlier than the current protest movement. They said, well, soon after 2014, so even after the Ahok affair, they started to see through certain policies, like, okay, what is the real change here? So,
but is that skepticism equally applied, not just to the establishment, but also to what may be propagated elsewhere as well?
One of the very important things about this new movement that is emerging now is that it's not necessarily anti-government, and especially not anti-Jokowi.
So it's more issue-based than personality-based is possibly what you're saying?
Absolutely. Issue-based, and because it's multiple issues, it's much more about the structure than about a particular policy.
What about the actual social media itself, ranging from Facebook, which is incredibly popular in Indonesia, to Twitter, to Instagram, any of them? What should they be doing? Because again, there's been criticism saying that they don't take down misinformation type posts fast enough.
It depends, because who are they supposed to listen to, right? Is that a government that is becoming more and more conservative? Is that a public that is becoming more and more conservative? Or is it the progressives, whoever that may be? So maybe instead of putting the responsibility on the social media giants, who will be there anyway, is really the government's responsibility to foster digital literacy among its population. Of course, the big problem is that old people in the government themselves could use a good course in digital literacy, so they might actually learn from the young people.
But aren't we also seeing a difference between ideologies?
No, there's absolutely a big division, and this is something that we see not just in Indonesia, right? But one of the things that I notice is a very big aversion to dogmatism, and actually feel spurred in expressing their ideological convictions from a more emotional sort of drive that we see. That is very much also one of the consequences of social media, or how they learn political engagement through social media. Engaging online is something that taps very deeply into a sort of subjective sense of self, because if you share an expression, and this is regardless of ideological stance, right? If you share an opinion, a political stance or anything, then if just sharing a news story, you don't even have to write it, then it still becomes part of your self-expression because it's on your wall, so to speak, it's on your personal profile.
So doesn't it amplify, in fact, the differences? Each grouping is echo chambering in their Facebook accounts, their Instagram accounts, and just reinforcing their own prejudices.
It's never enough to just judge, political stances, political attitudes, political identities and beliefs on statements, expressed on social media alone. So, and this echo chambering thing, it's not necessarily so that they reinforce existing beliefs, because from an individual point of view, it might actually help people to form opinions, to discover opinions, so that might be different from their surroundings. Are
the youth movements that we're seeing now in any way related to the youth movements that we see in Hong Kong or in India? Or is it all terribly parochial?
Interestingly, there are actually connections being made online on social media between these movements, but this is all very embryonic. So in last September, for instance, I saw on Twitter a lot of Hong Kong students spontaneously reaching out to Indonesian students who were on the streets, and there were no previous ties, so they had to really go. They had to really rely on what they could see on their social media profiles, like, hey, this guy's or this girl is apparently protesting, so maybe I can send a message on Twitter and say, hey, I'm from Hong Kong, I want to support you, here are some tips, let me know if you need anything and if we can build something, together. So there are embryonic solidarity ties being or emerging at the moment, and whether they will be sustainable in terms of becoming a sort of transnational kind of movement, we'll need to see. I don't think that's necessarily also the priority at the moment, because the national issues are so strong and require all attention. But they see links, they see connections in structural kind of injustices that they are fighting against.
So you, from what I understand, you're saying that there are many, many variations and different levels of commitment.
No, absolutely. And this is where it is very important that we do have these international organizations where some of the core activists are also involved. So they become a sort of, these core activists, as you call them, they become a sort of node in the network that is expanding at the moment. And these may be different networks. So there's the LGBT in Southeast Asia network, there is the labor unions network, there's all kinds of activist media organizations, networks and everything. And they are connected, especially through people. So the connections are becoming also much more personalized, but therefore also much more real or authentic in a sense.
Is there some fundamental change that we're talking about?
The current generation is very much aware that they don't want to be the boomer generation. I mean, it's not fair to call it anti-boomer, but of course the saying, right? The slogan of the motto of the Generation Z especially, like, okay, boomer, you've had your chance now, now it's our turn. Nice try. So there's a very strong sentiment that it needs to be a new movement, a new generational movement, which really presents a fundamental break.
Well, if I were to ask you to look in your crystal ball, in the coming 10 years, how is digital media going to be shaping or being shaped by this youth group?
Especially being shaped by, actually. It will become more and more ingrained into everyday life generally, but also everyday struggles. So the connective action that we see now, especially among particular groups of digital youth, and we have to understand that digital youth are still a very small minority of the general youth population. They're very much, if we talk about millennials, then we talk about the digital youth, right? But there's this huge population of underprivileged millennials that we see now being neglected in all of this story. So in the next, if I were to look in my crystal ball, then I will see that this underprivileged proportion of the millennial generation, or Gen Z also,
who don't have 3 iPads.
Who don't get 3 iPads, indeed, but they will also be more and more connected, because that is also a priority of the Jokowi government, to also connect villages. So what will happen if not just this privileged core that is urban, middle class, highly educated, gets active online, but also the vast masses of other youth, so to speak, who have other concerns.
They may be the real disruptors.
I expect as much.
More demonstrations or fewer demonstrations?
I guess more. I absolutely predict more demonstrations, but this really depends on the response of the government.
But when do these demonstrations, when do these expressions of dissatisfaction or wanting to be heard turn violent?
When they are repressed, this is usually the case. I mean, of course, there's going to be always provocateurs. This is actually established, institutionalized part of the system in Indonesia on how to quell demonstrations. And otherwise, repression is the clearest trigger of violence in these protests.
And you don't accept the argument that some have made that the violence comes from the fact that they have been incited by external forces?
I know from conversations from, the poorer populations as well, that they're not dumb, they're not stupid, and especially the youth I mean, everyone has a mobile phone in the cities, including the poorer kind of urban population, and they are on social media all the time, so they learn from that. There's a very strong political awareness actually, but it's very hard to kind of direct that when your everyday reality is just everyday violence of life. So one of the biggest important things for the government to do, and all kinds of institutions in authority, in power, they should really start really listening to young people of different layers. So what we have now is Jokowi has included in his presidential staff, 7 of the 12 staff members are millennials, right? In order to kind of learn from their ideas and have this fresh wind in his policy. But this is a very small group of millennials that are the main target group of the government's Industry 4.0 policy. They're all social entrepreneurs, they have studied abroad, they are CEOs, young CEOs. So there should be a sort of platform where you get youth from different groups, different layers in society, having a dialogue with people in government, with the president. They are making a real serious effort to tackle real problems that don't just concern them, the big things that concern society, the earth, with the climate change protests. So that should be applauded. That should be facilitated and welcomed and encouraged and developed into not just demonstrations, but also, actual involvement in policy change. That would be wonderful.
Dr. Yatun, thank you very much for being on In Conversation.
Thank you so much for the opportunity. It's been my pleasure.